Hello and welcome to this webinar focusing on a new OECD report, Low Performing Students, Why They Fall Behind and How to Help Them Succeed. With us are Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, and Daniel Salinas, the main analyst responsible for the report. Andreas and Daniel will be here to answer your questions after the presentation of the report. So please send your questions at any time during the presentation to Eric Magnuson through the chat function on your computers. Andreas?
Thank you. PISA has shown us for some years now that almost any country has a significant share of students who do not even reach the most basic levels of performance. We wanted to know who those students are, why they fall behind, but also what we can do to help them to succeed, what we can learn from international comparisons. So that's what the report is about, that's what the results are about. What do we mean by low performance? It's basically, PISA established 6 levels of proficiency, and level 2 is considered the baseline level of proficiency, where students can demonstrate elementary skills to read, they can understand simple text, they can master basic mathematical operations, they understand scientific concepts, and so on. Students who do not master this level, level 2, they are called low performers. And they can still do something in reading and math and in science, but they are not reaching the most basic levels of performance. Let me give you an example. This was a task that we used in mathematics. Mei Ling from Singapore was preparing to go to South Africa for 3 months as an exchange student, and she wanted to change some money. She found out that exchange rate between Singapore dollars and South African rand was 1 Singapore dollar to 4.2 South African rand. Now she wants to change $3,000 into South African rand at that exchange rate. So the question is, how much money does she need for that? Essentially what you have to do is you have to multiply 3,000 by 4.2 and you get 12,600. Not a really difficult task, but you can actually see that a fair number of students struggle with such basic tasks. And actually look at this around countries. There are some countries in which even the majority of students struggle with such basic tasks. So that's basically what we mean by low performance. Let's have a look at how prevalent the problem is. This is the percentage of low performers, students below level 2, reaching sort of level 1 or below in math. If you look to the right side of the chart, to Shanghai in China, you're going to have trouble finding any of those students when you go to a classroom. Very, very small share. If you go to the left side of the chart, Indonesia, Peru, Colombia, Qatar, Jordan, Brazil, and so on, you have trouble overlooking them. You have between 60 and 70% of students not even reaching the most basic levels of math performance. Huge variation across countries. And they're not typically a random group. In fact, you can see that when you look at this across social background. Many of those low-performing students come from disadvantaged groups. So if a country has a sizable share of low performers, you're going to find them concentrated often at the bottom end of the social spectrum. And that's actually giving us already the first indication. Most countries that minimize the share of low performers are very good in leveraging the talent of disadvantaged students. Very good in aligning resources with the challenges, attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, and so on. But you see here on this chart, the consequences of not doing it. Basically, large social disparities, with concentration of poor performance among the disadvantaged. This is an interesting way of comparing average performance on PISA, how well does a country do overall on the horizontal axis, with the share of low performers. And what it really tells you that it is very, very hard to get your overall performance to a decent level if you do not address underperformance in the system. Most countries on the right side, they are doing well overall, but they're also very, very good in actually addressing underperformance in the system. Most countries on the left side actually see that underperformance is a very important driver of poor overall performance. That relationship, now keep that in mind, this is very, very important. Of course, you know, when you get to countries like Korea, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, and so on, there it's very, very hard to, you know, getting further gains overall by addressing underperformance. Those countries probably need to look at the distribution much more widely. But for the majority of countries, you know, underperformance is a significant drag on the overall quality of the education system. Why is it important? Well, we have data that show actually those at the bottom end of the performance spectrum are significantly more likely to drop out of school. That's shown by our longitudinal PISA data. Low skills tend to be persistent over time. Essentially, you know, what happens to people in adulthood, in later life, whether it's workplace training, higher education, most of those kind of things tend to reinforce, not moderate, initial skill differentials. Those who need better training, more advanced education later in the life, are most likely to get the least from it. We also see that it's a very important relationship with earnings. Low skills have limited access to better paying and more rewarding jobs. There are lots of poorer health and less social and political participation. There's a lot of consequences that low performance brings with this, and unfortunately it is very, very hard to remedy. What you haven't sort of got right at the age of 50 is very, very hard to correct later on. That's why it's so important to look at this. We can also look at this economically. Imagine, you know, the lower middle income countries in PISA would be able to address underperformance. Get every student at least to sort of complete level 1, get to the threshold of level 2. Well, you know, you're talking about 6 times the size of the current economies that actually they could generate over the working life of those 15-year-olds if they address underperformance. It shows you that, you know, the benefits of addressing underperformance dwarf any conceivable costs of improvement. You know, if they would actually just increase enrollment, you know, getting the students who are not in school into school, that's also buying them a little bit, but not that much. And if they do both, you know, get everybody enrolled in making sure every student reaches at least level 2, that sort of relative price is very significant. Now, in the upper middle income countries, those numbers are a little smaller. In the high income countries, naturally, you have higher skill levels, they are smaller. In the high income OECD countries, even smaller. But even in those countries, the potential gains to our economies from addressing underperformance in countries, you know, like France, United States, Japan, the high income OECD countries, those gains would still be in the order of magnitude of the total amount of money that we invest in education, in school education today. So we have any reason to look into it. Well, let's have a look a little bit into numbers again. This chart shows you sort of the total number of low performers that we have found across 65 countries taking part in PISA. It's about 13 million people, and of those, about half actually don't do well in any of the subjects that we assess. And then there's sort of 2 million that are struggling in math, but doing sort of decently in other areas, and so on. So it varies a bit, but you talk about a fair amount, it's a very large number of people not reaching even the most basic levels of performance. Now, one thing is interesting. You know, people would often say, well, you know, isn't that about poverty? Isn't that about, you know, context? Isn't that about spending on education and so on? Well, if that would be all of the answer, you'd see very little change in this. But interestingly, you know, we compared those numbers between 2003 and 2012, and you can see if you look to the left side of the chart, there's been some amazing success. If you look to the Americas, you know, look at Brazil or Mexico. If you look to Europe, look to Turkey, Poland, Italy, the Russian Federation, Portugal, Germany. There's been a number of countries where we can see a very significant reduction in the share of low performance. Well, on the other end of the spectrum, Sweden would be a country where actually the share of low performance has increased. So there are countries where things have gone south. No? But overall, I think what this data shows is that this is something actually that policy can make a very significant difference. So why do students fall behind? Well, there are things that relate to the students themselves, there are things that relate to the schools, and there are things that relate to the systems. It's about socioeconomic status, it's about demography, it's about how they progress through education. It's about the attitudes and behavior. You think about the schools. It's about the composition of schools. To what extent is there socioeconomic segregation? It's about the learning environment. It's about human resources, teaching, administration. And when you look at the system, how do we allocate resources across the school system? How do we actually allocate students across the school system? And how do we run education? Let's have a look at those factors in turn. Starting with the most basic thing, the social and economic status of students. And indeed, what you can see on this chart is that social background is an important determinant of low performance. No? On average, you can say, even after controlling for everything else that we know about the students, disadvantaged students are about 4 times more likely to be low performers than privileged students. But again, you know, what's interesting is that those odds ratios vary so significantly across countries. There are some countries, the Netherlands, Croatia, Macau, Korea, Slovenia, and so on, where actually we don't see a very strong relationship between the two. On the other hand, some countries, you know, if you are a disadvantaged student, you're very likely to be also low performer. So actually the impact of social background on this risk of low performance varies very significantly. Let's have a look at gender. In mathematics, boys are more likely to be low performers. Girls are more likely to be low performers, sorry. In reading, it's the other way around. Boys are significantly more likely to be low performers. And in science, it's a slight advantage for the girls. But basically, you can see there are gender patterns that are pretty consistent across countries. In reading, they are strong. Immigration. It's actually a surprise to many. Many would sort of think intuitively, well, immigrants had a hard time getting into the country, they have to learn language and so on. So that's a significant difference. But actually, you know, the odds of being a low performer if you're an immigrant are not that high, particularly when you account for other student characteristics like social background. At least in most countries. There are only a few countries where you could say actually being an immigrant is a significant disadvantage. Let's look at students' progress through the education system. Pre-primary education. Now, those who actually have access to pre-primary education have a significantly lower risk of being poor performers, in some countries particularly. You can see actually the percentages vary hugely for some countries, particularly when that participation in pre-primary education has been sustained, you know, for more than a year. That's basically what the orange triangle is about. You can actually see that the risk of low performance in many countries drops down to 10%. Whereas, you know, in those very same countries, you have risks that actually are significantly larger if students didn't have pre-primary education. And we have already accounted for social background here, so that's really what we assess to be the net effect. And we've also not taken into account things like quality of pre-primary education, which is purely incidence and intensity of pre-primary learning on outcomes. Grade repetition. If you have repeated a school grade, you're significantly more likely to be a poor performer. Now it's hard to discern, you know, what's cause and effect. It could well be, you know, that the low performers were asked to repeat a grade, but it could also be the other way around, in the sense that, you know, when we make it too easy for teachers or schools to pass the problem on to the students, to just do the same thing once again, rather than investing in the students to address specific issues of underperformance. And the reason why I say that's at least a possible explanation to it, that we've actually found no evidence that grade repetition increases performance. Most of the students, you know, going through the same thing one more year, end up with the very same problems, with the very same performance. And you can see here the gap is significant. Program orientation. In most countries, not in all, in most countries actually students at age 15 who are enrolled in a vocational program are significantly more likely to be poor performers. Does it mean that vocational education is of lower quality than academic education? Not necessarily. In fact, this is more likely to be a selection effect because the distinction between academic and vocational education typically happens around that age. You know, 13, 14, 15, that's the age at which students often get sort of divided. So they're pretty young, pretty recently only moved into those fields. Still, we see a big performance gap. So what's the explanation? Most likely a selection effect. Does a selection effect matter? I'm going to come to this later. Actually, it does, because typically when students end up to be surrounded by other students with low performance and other students with certain disadvantages, that's when their own disadvantage gets magnified. So in fact, it does have consequences, even if we can't say it relates to the quality of provision alone. Now, one of the things that we found is that the risk of low performance is actually cumulative. Look at this. If you are socioeconomically disadvantaged, you have a higher risk of being low performance than if you are socially advantaged, after accounting for everything else. And that's basically what we have seen before. And then you can look at other demographic factors, and you can see how the risk is rising. And then you can look at the education factors that we study, and you can see actually how those things add up further to this. Imagine, you are very unlucky. You are disadvantaged. You happen to be a girl in mathematics. You happen to have an immigrant background. You speak a different language than the language that is spoken in school, at home. You live in a rural area, you have a single parent, you have less than a year of pre-primary education or no pre-primary education, you have already repeated the grade, and you are in a vocational track. Well, now your probability to be a low performer is around 80%. So the risk is really cumulative and that's why we also have to look at multidimensional policy responses. That's really what this kind of data tell us, is not enough to address one of those aspects. It's really about, finding a multidimensional policy response to the kind of issues that we are seeing on this chart. But I want to focus a bit more on students' attitudes and behaviors. There's some really interesting data on this chart. First, homework. What you can see here is that more hours spending homework is associated with a significantly lower risk of low performance, at least up to a point. When you look, for example, here, students who spend 6 hours on homework per week are 70% less likely to be low performance than students who do not do any homework. Now, what's interesting is that the difference isn't very large, whether we account for student characteristics or not. So it actually shows it's not, just disadvantaged students or privileged students who benefit from doing homework. It's actually across the board. The benefit actually extends to all student groups. We don't see much of a difference when we actually control things. So homework seems to be associated with this. Participation in mathematics-related activities. And this is really interesting. When you look at activities that require higher order skills, we can see that top performers, those students who do really well on the PISA test, participate a lot more, helping friends with mathematics, talking about math problems with friends, programming computers, taking part in mathematics competitions. Those kinds of intellectually engaging activities are ones that top performers are highly overrepresented. Well, when you look at more social or recreational activities, participation in a math club or playing chess, that's where actually low performers seem to be overrepresented. So what it suggests to us is actually, trying to engage low-performing students in those kinds of intellectually interesting activities could be a way to address those kinds of problems. We also looked, to what extent students perceive investing in mathematics to be productive, making a difference. And the results are very interesting as well. If you look at just, investing effort, we don't see any difference between high and low performance of people. Most students tell, I invest a little bit in working hard on my math homework, I study hard for mathematics tests, and so on. But when, it relates to questions that look at the outcomes of those efforts, we call it self-efficacy. And I'm confident that actually if I invest in mathematics, I'm going to be better. The belief that, good performance is not the result of talent, but it's the result of effort, work. I can own my success. That's where you can really see that the differences become very, very large. That basically low performers in math don't see the effort to be productive, investing in effort, whereas top performers actually have this sense of self-esteem. So once again, you're helping students to understand, that they can make it, that they can do well. And that's the kind of characteristic that we see very dominant in East Asia. When we ask students, for example, what makes you really, really good in mathematics? Many students in Europe and most students in the United States say, well, it's all about talent. It's not something I can do something about. My school system is just sorting me. But when you ask that very same question to students in Singapore or in Shanghai in China, you get about 9 out of 10 students telling you, if I study really, really hard, I trust my teacher is going to help me and I'm going to be successful. This is something that is really significant in policy terms. One of the questions that we ask ourselves also was, to what extent are students' attitudes towards school a result of their performance or a result of their social background? You can think about talents at school, do they come to school, perseverance, sense of belonging, self-efficacy in mathematics. And what's interesting is, if you look at low social background students and high social background students who are not doing well, who are low performers, the pattern is almost identical. All the bars are going down. Low performers tend to have more negative attitudes on any of those dimensions. When I look at high performing students, irrespective of whether they come from disadvantaged or privileged background, all the bars are going up. What this tells me is that actually students' attitudes towards school and learning is really about the performance. It's not about the socioeconomic status. Look at this. It's also interesting. If you're not a low performer, you generally have positive attitudes to school. If you are generally okay, but you don't do well in one subject, the bar is just starting to go down. That's why it's so important to diagnose issues early, to intervene. If the student doesn't do well in math or reading, help them in math, help them in reading. Don't wait until that student sort of falls behind in every subject, because what you can really see when they are a low performer in 2 subjects or in all subjects, these bars become sort of very, very heavy. They weigh very heavy on students. So that's why it's really important to ensure that students don't get to the point where they become actually disengaged. That's again, an example why great repetition, making the student to do everything again, is not particularly effective. Helping students to address the areas where they are particularly weak is what can help them most. Now that was about students. Let's have a quick look at schools. Some interesting factors here. Socioeconomic inclusion in schools. Basically what I mean by this is, if you're on the right side of the chart, schools try to reflect their society in their schools. They don't, group students, divide students up by social background, putting the rich kids in one school and the poor ones in another school. Social inclusion means that the school reflects the society and the community of the country. That's on the right side. If you're on the left side, there's a lot of socioeconomic segregation. Now what we can actually see is the relationship is not perfect, there are a lot of exceptions, but there's a tendency, the more inclusive, socially inclusive education systems are, the lower the share of underperformance. Again, there are exceptions to this pattern, but that is a trend that we can actually see. Teachers' expectations. Where teachers actually expect their students to do well, where they have high expectations on students, we can actually see that the risk of underperformance is lower. Conversely, where teachers have low expectations, we are seeing a greater risk of being low performance. And that is even true after accounting for socioeconomic status of the students in the school. That's the bar. The dot is what you would see when you don't control for this. The significance would be even larger. Teachers' expectations. Don't giving up on students, ensuring that every student is expected to do well and get the support that they need. And that brings me to the next, teacher support. And interestingly, we measure this through the lens of students. We ask students to what extent they feel their teachers could be supportive from them. That teachers understand, what they can do, that teachers help them when they need help, and so on. And where that is the case, the risk of underperformance is significantly low. It is in most countries. You can actually see that the odds ratios in some countries, even after accounting for social background, are very significant. Teachers' morale. also a factor that clearly relates to underperformance. That the teachers' morale is low, we are more likely to see a larger share of underperforming students. What about the causal nature of the relationship? For both ways. If you are sort of, as a teacher, struggling with students who are overperforming, maybe your morale is lower than if you work with a highly motivated and very sort of advanced group of students. But the relationship is there and is important. Parental expectations. Particularly, when you look at this before accounting for social background, you can see how powerful the expectations of parents are, the expectations parents have towards the school in actually lowering the risk of underperformance. Many schools complain, all these parents who want to sort of invade their schools and not be demanding on what their students learn and so on. But again, our data suggests it's actually a good thing. Parental expectations can actually lower the risk of underperformance consistently across countries. Now, we're trying to put all of this together and create sort of the correlations between those different issues. You can look at the quality of the physical infrastructure. And you can see as the quality of the physical infrastructure, the school building, the environment in the school increases. We're going towards the right on the index of the quality of the physical infrastructure. The percentage of low performance in mathematics declines across countries. So having crumbling schools, poor buildings, is not a good sort of predictor for low share of underperformance. And you can see that's true also for the quality of the school's educational resources, as we can measure that. So basically the reports from school principals. And you can actually see teacher shortage, where there is more perceived teacher shortage, but where principals say it's difficult for them to find qualified teachers. You can see actually the risk of underperformance is rising. Again, cause and effect is unclear from this. It can go both ways, but the relationship is important. Class size, that's not so sort of striking here, but you can see that where the class size is rising, you see that the risk of underperformance is increasing slightly. Now, when you look at this, you have to make choices. Do I sort of focus on reducing teacher shortage? Do I focus on teacher quality? Do I focus on infrastructure? Do I focus on class size? These are difficult spending choices that countries have to make. One of the things that we found from PISA generally is, where high-performing countries are confronted with the choice of, between a better teacher and a smaller class, they typically go for the better teacher. But here you can see basically, they're all sort of important in one of the other. You can look at this also, by level. And what's really interesting, if you are sort of below the OECD average in terms of the quality of the physical infrastructure, that's where actually school buildings matter a lot. Basically, ensuring a decent minimum kind of physical infrastructure is really important. Once you get above the OECD average, we don't see much of a relationship anymore. So having a beautiful building and a functional one doesn't seem to be very important, but sort of having at least sort of the basic infrastructure in place seems to be really important. Equity. This is really interesting. This is not about how much resources are spent on education, but it is how equitably resources are invested in education. This is about, how are the resources aligned with the challenges? How do we ensure that the students who need the resources most get access to the right resources? How do we make sure that, talented teachers are actually focusing on disadvantaged students in schools? And you can actually see the more equitably resources are being invested, the lower the risk of poor performance. The more equitably resources are invested, the higher the share of top performing students. I'm showing you this because, many people look at this as a trade-off. If I put all my money into low-performing students in schools, don't I risk their performance at the top end of the distribution going to deteriorate? Well, this chart, at least when you look at this across countries, suggests it's not the case. In fact, you win on both ends of the spectrum. You reduce the risk of underperformance, and you can raise the risk of top performance in the school system. That's about equity. About the school structure, one of the things that we have seen consistently is that any form of stratification, particularly when it's vertical, basically, you attract students, you group students, you provide ability grouping, all of that tends to raise the risk of poor performance. Right. It tends to polarize student performance. It may not depress overall performance. In fact, there's no evidence for that. Stratification is not systematically related with overall poor performance of the education system, but it tends to be more socially segregated, where we track students, where we group students. We want to group them by their talent, by their abilities, but we often end up grouping them by their social background. And that sort of seems to polarize outcomes and raise the risk of underperformance. And it's quite consistent across countries, as we see. So let me wrap up my presentation. What have we learned from this? What are the risk factors of lower performance? What can we do about it? When you look at students, it has to do with socioeconomic disadvantage, and that's very hard to deal with. You can't make poor parents rich very quickly. The policy lever here lies not in directly addressing socioeconomic disadvantage, but moderating its impact. And as you could see, some countries are much more effective in basically leveraging the talent of disadvantaged students, particularly the countries in East Asia. Demographic background, we've got to look carefully, what is it that makes sort of good girls at a disadvantage in mathematics and boys at a disadvantage in reading? Does it have to do with the reading material, the kind of reading instruction that we provide? And so if you're looking at this, self-beliefs are very important predictors for this. So actually looking at this by gender is very instructive. Immigration, how do we support students with an immigrant background? How do we deal with language minorities? Some countries are having very, very effective systems in place that address this very quickly. Other countries see huge performance disadvantage of students with an immigrant background. Interesting, it's not just, where those students come from. In fact, our data show that the country of destination where students go to has a much larger impact on their success in school than the country where they come from. So there's a lot that basically students can do. Single parent family is a clear risk factor. And then, how you move through education. The lack of pre-primary education is a clear risk factor, where we don't invest early into schooling. We can see this grade repetition, having students repeating a grade, vocational programs, and basically, again, that doesn't mean, vocational education is a great strength of many education systems, but we need to ensure that they don't become a trap for disadvantaged or poor performing students, but that we basically make them equally attractive to academic programs. And you could see, when you look at the data for some of the countries, Switzerland and Germany are good examples, where actually academic and vocational programs have a similar share of underperformance. So actually those systems do succeed with giving them an equal prestige. And then student attitudes and behavior, if you don't go to school, you don't learn anything, that's obvious, perseverance is important, and so on. If you look at the school, concentration of disadvantage, where you basically aggregate disadvantage to a certain level, it becomes very, very hard for schools to deal with this. So anything school systems can do to sort of spread out disadvantage, to have schools that are socially inclusive, will at the end of the day benefit all students. Having high expectations for students, teachers having high expectations generally see lower levels of underperformance, being supportive, high levels of teacher morale, providing adequate after-school opportunities, involvement of parents, parental pressure, parental expectations, very important. And then on resources, lack of qualified teachers. It's pretty obvious, the quality of education can never be better than the quality of teachers. But also the lack of educational resources, investing the resources where they can make most of the difference is really important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We have a few questions from our attendees. one of which is, according to one of the slides, there has been some increase in low performers in some countries, for instance in Sweden. What could be the possible reasons for this?
Yeah, Sweden is quite a sad story overall in performance on the PISA test. Basically, Sweden used to be one of the models for education. It had a high overall performance and basically very little variability in school performance. Very short, it's a small share of low-performing students. But basically in the 90s and still in the 2000s, Sweden basically sort of introduced a lot of choice in education, introduced a lot of kind of, let a thousand flowers bloom, everybody could build a school, but forgot to build the kind of quality assurance system that you need to actually make markets work in education. Now, there are some choice-based systems that function wonderfully. If you look at the Netherlands, if you look at Flanders, if you look at Hong Kong, basically these are all systems with a lot of school autonomy and responsibility at the level of schools, a lot of choice for parents, but they typically have a very strong system built around this, and that's basically what Sweden missed out. And what we have observed over the years, you know, so it's not PISA assessment after PISA assessment, we saw a growing share of underperforming students in the system.
Thank you. Another listener makes a comment that countries have to make spending choices. Would you agree that reducing class size is less efficient than increasing teaching hours or instruction time? And also, you mentioned something called good teachers. What do you mean by good teachers, and how would you identify them?
Yeah, these are both difficult questions. On the spending choices, yes, our data consistently show that the quality of teaching, the quality of teachers is a far more important determinant than the class size. Of course, you know, everything else being equal, you know, if you have a smaller class, you're going to make it easier for teachers, you're going to likely raise outcomes. But if you have to make the choice, you know, I have $100 extra, where am I going to invest them? Then investing these $100 in smaller classes is probably not the best choice. It is certainly not the choice that most high-performing education systems make. If you look, for example, to the countries in East Asia, you know, China has 50 students in a class, but they invest very much in the teacher quality. Now, that comes to the second question: how do we know who's a good teacher? It is very hard to know. There are actually very few robust teacher evaluation systems in countries. But one thing that we can see is that high-performing education systems typically give teachers plenty of opportunities to continue their professional development. Singapore, you get 100 hours invested in every teacher every year to actually upgrade their profession. So systems have highly diverse career paths for teachers. Teachers have lots of opportunities to sort of grow in their professional careers. They are highly sort of collaborative environments. There's a lot of professional autonomy, but in a collaborative environment. So in Shanghai, if you're in Japan, you know, you would prepare your lessons together with other teachers. You would typically observe in other teachers' classrooms once per week. You would participate in a teaching competition once per month. And sort of those factors are likely to impact on the quality of teachers. How do we know? One test, of course, are the PISA results, but we also have from our TALUS surveys measures of self-efficacy, where we actually ask teachers themselves, you know, what are the kind of things that actually we believe make you a better teacher? And those things come consistently true. It's kind of professional learning opportunities, collaborative environment in school, strong leadership. And again, you know, most high-performing countries tend to invest their resources in those aspects rather than just, you know, reducing classes.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Daniel would like to contribute a comment here. We received a question also that we talk about the existence of a cumulative disadvantage associated with a number of individual risk factors. Did you also find a multiplicative disadvantage? In other words, a significant interaction between certain factors, and if so, which factors? This person was thinking about the literature on gender differences in school performance that shows how boys underperform girls among socioeconomically disadvantaged students, but they perform better than girls amongst advantaged students. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So the short answer is yes. We clearly see that if you look at the gap in the probability between disadvantaged students and more advantaged students with less risk factors, and then you compare the socioeconomic gap in a context of several risk factors, you do see that the accumulation of risk is more severe for socioeconomically disadvantaged students. So this actually means that not only socioeconomically disadvantaged students tend to be encumbered with more of these risk factors, because low-income families is correlated with with immigration, for example, with family structure, with geographic location in rural areas, etc. But then also that the effect of these factors accumulates more into disadvantaged families.
Thank you, Daniel. Another question we have here is, how does PISA define and measure social inclusion? And there was a related question to this question. For example, Swiss schools are seen in the presentation as inclusive in the diagram, while the education system in Switzerland is in fact stratified.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, with social inclusion, we do not mean that the system isn't, using tracking or, providing different types of programs. What we mean is that these programs are not socioeconomically stratified. Basically, what you have in Switzerland is that, privileged and disadvantaged students both attend vocational schools, and privileged and disadvantaged students both attempt academic tracks. What we look at here, we define social inclusion basically to what extent is the schools representative of the societies in which students live, and that's the case in Switzerland. It is not the case if we look at, for example, the neighboring country, Germany. There you can really see that a similar system, which is also highly tracked, tracks students often a lot more by their social background than is the case in Switzerland. So this chart doesn't look at whether the system, offers choice or diversity in programs. It merely looks at whether those choices reflect the diversity of students adequately.
In addition to that, Andreas, I would like to add that in some cases, for example, in Sweden, it's the case that students who are in the PISA assessment have not yet been sorted into different programs. So the sorting is after the age of 15 when they are participating in PISA. So that actually can explain why that's the case.
Thank you. We have another question. What is the role of school principals or directors? This person suggests that school principals and directors are the most important actors in school systems, as they have the power to shape and modify school regulations and rituals and atmosphere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, school principals, when it comes to equity-related decisions within the school, that is precisely the role that principals can play. Principals can, group teachers, make sure that teachers collaborate, that social disadvantage is detected earlier, that the resources which the school has are adequately addressing disadvantage. They can invest in the training of teachers. They can ensure that, those teachers that have the greatest capacity, the greatest talent, are actually helping the students who need that most. So in a way, principals are a very, very powerful kind of moderator of those processes.
Did you do any kind of decomposition analysis to see which of the factors, student, school, or system factors, has the largest impact?
Daniel, you want to say?
Yes. So it's a hard question actually, because the effect of many of these factors vary by country. They have a lot of variation across countries, right? So some of all the factors that we presented are significant on average across OECD countries. Socioeconomic background tends to be the dominant factor, but what is interesting that Andreas explained well is that it is not the only one, and there is a range of other demographic factors that are also very important. And then the factors related with the progress of students through the school system are very significant as well. So there isn't really a short answer for that. It really varies across countries, and on average, I would say that the dominant factor is, of course, socioeconomic background, and some of the other are important as well.
Okay, thank you. A question that's related to the PISA test itself. How does PISA account for the impact of the assessment itself on the performance data? For example, this questioner asked, the conversion of currency question may not make sense to a 15-year-old who has never traveled, for example. And there are those, this questioner says, who are not in a general stream or academic stream because they simply do not understand abstract mathematics.
Yeah, that's a fair question. What we basically try to do is to make sure that the PISA test overall is sufficiently fair to countries across the world. You know, for some students, some tasks may be more difficult. For other students, other tasks are more difficult. But every task that actually enters the PISA test is validated by all countries that participate for the curricular validity, for the instructional validity, for the cultural appropriateness. So there's actually very, very careful analysis being done. And often we do expect students also to extrapolate from their current kind of environment. For example, yeah, it may be that students have not traveled, but we expect them to understand the context and to figure out, you know, what is the mathematics involved in a task that they may not have seen before. So, but overall, the issues around, you know, making sure that the test is culturally appropriate, that it's curricularly relevant, there's a very, very careful analysis being done, and basically we only go into the field with a test when we have basically all countries signed up to the framework and the assessment instruments.
Thank you. Another question. In Spain, the number of pupils who attend early education is higher than in other countries. So why is this not coherent with Spain's level of low performers?
Well, it is. You know, even in Spain, you can see that attending pre-primary education is an advantage, but obviously that's just one of many factors. You know, you can have a great start in schooling, and then still, you know, students fall behind. That's actually true for a fair number of countries. The United States would be another example where students start quite well in primary school, but then they tend to fall behind in middle school and high school. So in fact, you know, it's just one of many factors, but still a very important factor. And one other aspect here is also, it's not just the incidence and participation in pre-primary education. Education quality is obviously also important. That's not measured here. I can't talk to Spain on this, but you need to look at all of those factors together. And overall, again, you know, we found that pre-primary education, participation in pre-primary education actually does explain underperformance to quite an important extent. So it's a variable that I think countries should look at carefully.
Another PISA question is does PISA track teachers' expectations for their students, or whether teachers act to support their students as part of its assessment?
Yeah, actually the way we look at this is through the eyes of students. So we don't survey teachers directly, at least not for the 2012 assessment. We ask students to what extent, you know, they perceive their teachers to be supportive to them, to what extent they perceive their teachers to expecting a lot from them. And what we found over the years is actually that students have a very good eye for this. They have a very good sort of sense for the level of support they obtain and the quality of the instructional environment, and you can see that in the results. I mean, those student responses are quite predictive for what we see. We're speaking about the different aspects of the system that affect the probability of low performance. To what extent can correlations help gauge causal effects
This questioner asks, is it fair to make spending recommendations from correlations between things like infrastructure and the probability of low performance if we don't really know whether infrastructure is driving these kinds of correlations?
That is a very relevant question. In fact, the way we work on this at the OECD is we use this correlation as a starting point, and then we try to corroborate those findings with other types of analysis. You know, like for example, when I mentioned the point on spending choices between class size and teacher quality, you couldn't derive that from the correlation alone, but the correlation has inspired us to do further analysis to corroborate this. So from the correlations alone, you could not, discern cause and effect. It can, as I highlighted on several of the slides, it can always go both ways. You have to do additional analysis. One way in which you can often look at this is look at the high-performing countries. What kind of choices do they make? Again, it is not directly asserting cause and effect, but you can see clear and consistent patterns across high-performing countries. For example, the focus on teacher quality, the focus on high standards, the consistently high teacher expectations. Those things are factors that we find quite consistently across high-performing education systems. That's another angle to look at this. But in a nutshell, the correlation alone cannot give answers on cause and effect. You need to do additional analysis.
Thank you. Another question which is very timely. Do you think the tracking system in Germany is good for integrating the children of refugees?
Well, what our data show is that any form of stratification or tracking tends to reinforce socioeconomic disparities. Those systems are designed to make sure that students get a learning environment that is adapted to their intellectual capacities. That's the idea. But the reality is that education systems tend to be better at tracking students by their social background than by their academic potential. So with that context, we can actually say that highly stratified systems like that in Germany are not very conducive for students with an immigrant background or refugee background. And that's actually what the data show. Now, that being said, Germany, despite that system, has been very successful in actually making progress on this. They have not changed the tracking because it's politically very difficult, but they have been quite successful in mediating the impact of tracking. Making sure, for example, that the selection is fairer, that it's based on more objective data rather than just teachers' judgments or parents' judgment. So Germany has done a lot to mediate the negative effects of tracking on the future, on the sort of prospects of immigrant children. But overall, if you design a system from scratch, the prevalence of tracking is not a good way of doing it.
And there's a related question. How do we address the question of parental pressure for high achievement among immigrants, from immigrant parents who are now living in countries where the school systems are very different from those that were in their countries of origin?
Yeah, first of all, many immigrant parents actually have fairly high levels of education. We found at least that many immigrant children who are living in OECD countries today have parents who have a similar kind of educational background, at least one of the parents, than their families in the country of destination. So I don't think we should say that the academic kind of background that immigrant students have is generally lower. We have no evidence for that. But what is clear is that we need to help those parents navigate these education systems. Many education systems are incredibly complex, particularly those that are highly stratified. Early on in the student's life, you have to make very important decisions that are very difficult to correct. Sometimes it matters, one subject that you choose, but you can build on that. And therefore, helping parents navigate the education, helping immigrant parents navigate the education system in the country of destination can be hugely beneficial.
I have a question for Daniel. Do you think that grade repetition is a consequence of low performance, but not one of the causes of low performance?
Well, I think Andrea explained that fairly well. The more intuitive way to look at it is that low performance precedes grade repetition, right? But then if you look this over time or over the trajectory of the students through the education system, there are many studies that suggest that, for example, longitudinal studies, that grade repetition at earlier grades has consequences, on the one hand, on the attitudes of the students, on the other hand, on teachers' expectations. So then these two factors lead to low performance or can increase the probability of low performance at later grades. So since we are looking here at age 15, I would think that at least part of the difference that we see are due to grade repetition at earlier grades. But that being said, of course, this is a very difficult to disentangle with the data that we have, which is just correlational. So that's I think it's important to be careful when we interpret this data.
Yeah, just to add one angle to this, and that's basically the cost angle. You know, the social cost of one grade repeater in OECD countries is between $30,000 and $50,000, because your students are going to enter the labor force later and so on. So they're taking out a lot of money out of the system, and that money is most likely to be a lot better invested in helping those students find the right approaches right from the start, making sure that they do not fall behind, that they are sort of addressing their individual weaknesses. The second point, I think we should not underestimate the incentives we set for teachers. If I tell a teacher, well, if your students don't do well, just pass them on to the next teacher next year. I do not invest the effort. I may not have the resources to actually help struggling students. So actually, the cost of grade repetition, given also that we see very little in terms of improvement, are very high. The benefits are low, and therefore, getting those resources invested where we can make most of the difference, namely helping struggling students, personalizing learning opportunities, is certainly far more effective. It's a good example where I think we cannot discern cause and effect from the data slide that we presented here, but when you look at this in the broader context, and when you look at this, Daniel has cited other research in the context of other research, the pattern is pretty clear that grade repetition actually is largely sort of detrimental to student learning outcomes.
Question for you, Andreas. What is your opinion about the extent to which OECD countries that are less developed are bridging the performance inequalities based on gender?
Yeah, actually, there are some countries that have done really well on this. I want to quote Mexico here, or Turkey, Poland, that have actually been bridging gender gaps, socioeconomic gaps, despite having actually relatively little resources. So actually, there are some really good examples of countries that have made it a priority and achieved great learning gains.
I have a question here for Daniel. In your opinion, why are Latin American countries among the lowest performers in PISA?
Well, that's a hard question. I mean, one obvious question is that to some extent the performance in these kinds of tests relates to the level of income per capita of the countries. I mean, that's not a one-on-one correlation, but that probably explains part of it. What is more interesting, I think, is that actually these countries show different, between themselves there is some variation despite of their level of income is similar, and they also show different trends. Some of them have improved a lot. Some of them, for example, Colombia has seen a more stable pattern over time. So that's what I think I have to say for that.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. Any pointers from the research on where we can look about pedagogy for supporting low performers, techniques, methods, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. And a question like this report is probably least elusive because we do not have really data from from teachers, but when you look at students' perspectives on the instructional environment that we do measure, it's actually about personalization. So it's about, teachers understanding that students learn differently and maybe differently at different stages of their development. Teachers being able to embrace a broad pedagogic repertoire rather than, applying consistently one set of techniques. And it's really about teachers engaging with individual student needs. And this is also something where we can learn a lot from the East Asian education system. Despite very large classes, teachers typically have a very good and deep understanding of individual students because they collaborate across disciplines. They work with other teachers. They have actually the time and resources to work with students. Think about a teacher in Shanghai. They teach 2 or 3 courses per day. So they have actually plenty of time to work with individual students and build the kind of pedagogic environment that you need. But that's just the data that we have from the student perspective. As I said, we don't have direct measures on pedagogy or instruction.
Okay, I think that wraps it up. Thank you all very much for your interest in this report and in the OECD's work on education. As you may have seen on your screen, this webinar has been recorded and will be available in a couple of days on our website. That's www.oecd.org/edu. And again, thank you very much for attending.